Washington, D.C., November 1980. The votes are still being counted, but the outcome is already clear. Jimmy Carter has just lost one of the most lopsided presidential elections in modern American history. Inside the White House, the woman who had spent 4 years sitting in on cabinet meetings, traveling to foreign capitals as a diplomatic envoy, and quietly shaping policy decisions, is standing at the edge of it all, watching it collapse in real time. Her name is Rosalynn Carter, and almost nobody talks about her anymore. Not because she did nothing. She did more than almost any First Lady before her. But the story of what she tried to build, what went wrong around her, and what it cost her personally, that story has been buried under 4 decades of political history. It starts long before the White House. It starts in a small town in Georgia, with a girl who had very few options and decided early on that she was not going to accept that. Segment 7. Plains, Georgia, and the making of an unlikely partner. Plains, Georgia is the kind of town that does not prepare you for Washington. In the 1940s, when Rosalynn Smith was growing up there, it had a population of just a few hundred people. There was a main street, a peanut farm on the outskirts, and a set of social expectations that were as fixed and narrow as the roads leading into it. Rosalynn was born on August 18, 1927, the eldest of 4 children. Her father, Wilburn Edgar Smith, worked as a farmer and school bus driver. Her mother, Frances Alethea Murray, took in sewing to help support the family. It was not a life of comfort, but it was stable, until August 1940, when Wilburn Smith died of leukemia. Rosalynn was 13 years old. The death of her father changed the shape of her life immediately. As the eldest child, she took on responsibilities that most teenagers never face, helping her mother manage the household, keeping the younger children in line, learning early that the world did not make allowances for difficulty. Her mother went to work at the local post office. They got through it, but the experience of that loss, sudden, early, without warning, left a mark on Rosalynn that people who knew her well could always see beneath the surface. She was a good student, quiet and focused, and she graduated from Plains High School in 1944. She enrolled at Georgia Southwestern College in nearby Americus, one of the few options available to a young woman of modest means in that part of the state at that time. It was there, during the summer of 1945, that her life intersected with Jimmy Carter's in a way that neither of them had planned. Jimmy Carter was the son of a neighboring family. The Carters had a peanut farm just outside Plains, and he had left for the Naval Academy in Annapolis in 1943. He was home on leave in the summer of 1945 when his sister Ruth, who was Rosalynn's close friend, engineered a meeting between the two of them. They went on a date. Jimmy told his mother afterward that Rosalynn was the girl he intended to marry. He was not wrong. They married on July 7th, 1946, 3 weeks after Jimmy graduated from the Naval Academy. Rosalynn was 18 years old. She had known him, in any real sense, for less than a year. What followed was the life of a Navy wife, moving from base to base, managing the household, the finances, and 3 young sons with a competence that Jimmy recognized and depended on entirely. Then, in 1953, Jimmy's father died, and Jimmy made the decision that would redirect both of their lives permanently. He resigned his naval commission and moved the family back to Plains to take over the struggling Carter peanut farm. Rosalynn did not want to go back. She had spent 7 years building a life that belonged to her outside of Plains. A life with independence, with movement, with the sense that she was somewhere. The prospect of returning to the town she had grown up in, to the fixed expectations and small horizons she had worked to escape, was genuinely distressing to her. She told Jimmy as much. He went anyway, and she went with him. That moment, her protest and her compliance, says something important about the nature of their partnership in its early years. It was a partnership, genuinely and deeply so, but it was not yet an equal one. That would come later, slowly, through work and circumstance, and Rosalynn's own insistence. The peanut farm struggled at first. They lived in public housing initially because they could not afford anything else. Rosalynn threw herself into the business with the same intensity she brought to everything else, keeping the books, managing accounts, learning the finances in granular detail. By the early 1960s, the business had turned around, and Jimmy began to turn his attention toward politics. His first run for the Georgia State Senate came in 1962, and it was messy. There were allegations of ballot fraud in a primary that Jimmy initially appeared to lose, followed by a legal challenge that eventually reversed the result. He won the seat. And from that point forward, Rosalynn was not just a supportive spouse standing at the edge of campaign events. She was a working partner, handling the schedule, talking to voters, traveling separately to cover more ground. She was good at it, in ways that surprised people who expected a quiet farmer's wife and got something considerably sharper. By the time Jimmy ran for governor of Georgia in 1970, his second attempt, having lost a campaign in 1966, Rosalynn was campaigning independently, holding her own events, speaking in her own voice. She was not performing a role. She was doing the work. Jimmy won the governorship in November 1970. They moved to Atlanta. And it was there, during those 4 years in the Georgia governor's mansion, that Rosalynn began to develop the focus that would define the rest of her public life, and eventually put her at the center of one of the most ambitious and contested policy agendas of the Carter presidency. Segment 6. The Governor's Wife Who Refused to Stay Decorative. Most governors' wives in the early 1970s operated within a fairly well-understood set of expectations. They attended events, they hosted dinners, they appeared at ribbon cuttings and spoke warmly about their husbands. Some of them had causes, literacy programs, beautification projects, the kinds of initiatives that generated goodwill without generating controversy. Very few of them walked into policy meetings and stayed. Rosalynn Carter was not most governors' wives. In Atlanta, she began working seriously on the issue of mental health care in Georgia. This was not a politically glamorous cause. Mental health facilities in the early 1970s were, across much of the United States, severely underfunded and poorly managed. Places where people were warehoused rather than treated, where conditions were often genuinely terrible, and where the political will to address the problem was almost entirely absent because the people affected had very little political voice. Rosalynn had developed a personal connection to the issue through people she had known in Plains whose families had been touched by mental illness, and she pursued it with the methodical intensity that characterized everything she did. She visited facilities. She met with staff and with patients. She pushed Jimmy to make mental health reform a priority of his governorship, and he did, appointing a governor's commission to improve services for the mentally and emotionally handicapped, with Rosalynn as an active participant rather than a figurehead. The commission's work led to genuine reforms in how Georgia allocated resources for mental health services, and it established a template that Rosalynn would carry directly into the White House. She was also, during these years, developing a public presence that was harder to categorize than the press was quite comfortable with. She gave speeches. She had opinions on policy questions that she stated plainly. She kept her own schedule and traveled on her own behalf. Some of this generated quiet friction. There were people in Jimmy's political circle who found her directness difficult, who preferred a first lady type who smiled at the edges of events rather than one who showed up with prepared remarks and a list of follow-up questions. Rosalynn was not unaware of this. She was simply not particularly interested in accommodating it. When Jimmy announced his candidacy for president in December 1974, the campaign was regarded by almost everyone in national politics as a long shot of implausible proportions. He was a one-term governor of Georgia. He had no national profile. He had almost no money. He had a team of young, largely inexperienced advisors and a strategy that relied on winning the Iowa caucuses and the New Hampshire primary before the better-known candidates could consolidate their support. Rosalynn was part of the campaign machinery from the first day. She traveled to states Jimmy could not yet reach, attended events he could not attend, and functioned as a surrogate with a level of competence that his actual campaign surrogates frequently could not match. She spoke without notes. She answered questions directly. She shook hands in diners and union halls and living rooms with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing this for a decade, because she had. The campaign worked. Jimmy Carter won the Iowa caucuses in January 1976, a result that nobody had seriously predicted, and the momentum carried him through New Hampshire and eventually through a primary season that outlasted every candidate the Democratic establishment had considered a serious contender. He won the Democratic nomination, selected Walter Mondale as his running mate, and in November 1976 defeated the incumbent Republican President Gerald Ford in a race that was closer than it should have been, but was decisive enough. On January 20th, 1977, Jimmy Carter was inaugurated as the 39th President of the United States. He and Rosalynn walked the parade route from the Capitol to the White House rather than riding in the traditional motorcade, a gesture that was intended to signal simplicity and accessibility, and that the press received with the mixture of admiration and slight bewilderment that would come to characterize their response to the Carter administration generally. Rosalynn Carter became First Lady at 49 years old, and she had absolutely no intention of being a decorative one. But what she was walking into, what both of them were walking into, was a Washington that had its own deeply entrenched ways of operating. And the distance between what Rosalynn Carter intended to do with her position and what Washington was prepared to let a First Lady do was about to become one of the defining tensions of the entire presidency. Segment 5. Inside the cabinet room, a First Lady unlike any before her. The first signal that this was going to be a different kind of First Lady came quickly. Within weeks of the inauguration, it became known that Rosalynn Carter was attending Jimmy Carter's weekly foreign policy briefings, not as a guest, not as an observer sitting quietly in the corner, as a participant, someone who asked questions, who read the materials in advance, who followed up. This was not something that had happened before, at least not in any visible or acknowledged way. Previous First Ladies had exerted influence. Eleanor Roosevelt's influence on Franklin Roosevelt's domestic policy was well documented, and Lady Bird Johnson had been deeply involved in the Great Society's environmental components. But the idea of a First Lady physically present in substantive policy meetings, listed on the schedule as an attendee, was something different. It made people uncomfortable in ways they found difficult to articulate, without sounding as though they were simply objecting to a woman being in the room. Rosalynn pushed further. She held her own weekly lunch meetings with Jimmy, one-on-one, every Wednesday, where the two of them went through policy questions together. She was given an office in the East Wing with a full staff, and she used it as a working space rather than a ceremonial one. She attended state dinners, not just as hostess, but as someone who had been briefed on the diplomatic stakes of each conversation she would be having. And then, in the spring of 1977, Jimmy asked her to travel to Latin America on a formal diplomatic mission. This was an extraordinary thing to ask. The trip was not ceremonial. It was substantive. Rosalynn traveled to Jamaica, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Peru, Brazil, Colombia, and Venezuela over the course of 2 weeks, meeting with heads of state and foreign ministers to discuss the Carter administration's policy priorities in the region. Human rights, arms sales, the Panama Canal treaties, and economic development. She carried briefing books. She held press conferences. She reported back to the State Department. The reaction was complicated. In the United States, the press coverage ranged from admiring to deeply skeptical. Some commentators found the whole thing admirable and overdue, while others questioned whether it was appropriate for an unelected person to be conducting foreign policy. In Latin America, several of the leaders she met with later said they had found her direct and well prepared, which was not necessarily what they had expected. The trip generated more substantive diplomatic conversation than many official envoy visits of the same period. Back home, Rosalynn moved immediately into the work she had been planning since Atlanta, a national initiative on mental health. In February 1977, Jimmy signed an executive order establishing the President's Commission on Mental Health, with Rosalynn as its honorary chair, a title that, in her case, meant she ran the thing. She testified before the Senate in February 1979, the first First Lady to testify before Congress since Eleanor Roosevelt had done so in 1945, arguing for the passage of the Mental Health Systems Act, which aimed to overhaul the federal government's approach to mental health funding and services. The Mental Health Systems Act passed in October 1980 after 3 years of pushing. It was a genuine legislative achievement, the product of sustained effort and political maneuvering, and Rosalynn had been central to every stage of it. But by October 1980, the Carter presidency was in its final weeks, and the law that Rosalynn had spent years fighting for would be gutted by the incoming Reagan administration before it could be fully implemented. That particular cruelty, watching a signature achievement dismantled almost immediately, was one of several that defined the end of the Carter years. And to understand why the end came the way it did, you have to go back to 1979 and to a period that tested the Carter presidency and the Carter marriage in ways that the campaign trail had never prepared either of them for. Segment 4. The crises that broke the presidency. The Carter presidency did not fail because of any single event. It failed because of an accumulation of crises that arrived in sequence, each one compounding the damage of the one before, in a period roughly between 1979 and 1980 that political historians have returned to repeatedly as a case study in how quickly a presidency can lose its footing. The first was energy. The 1970s in the United States had been shaped, in large part, by the 1973 Arab oil embargo, fuel shortages, long lines at gas stations, and a growing awareness that the country's dependence on imported oil was a structural vulnerability nobody in Washington had adequately addressed. Carter came into office treating this as a central priority. He created the Department of Energy and pushed for conservation measures with a persistence that his own party often found exhausting. It was not enough. When the Iranian Revolution disrupted oil supplies in 1979 and gasoline prices spiked again, the public's patience ran out. The images of ordinary Americans unable to fill their tanks became the defining image of the Carter years for millions of people. In July 1979, Carter gave what became known informally as the Malaise speech, though he never used that word. Speaking from the Oval Office, he described a crisis of confidence in American society, arguing that a loss of collective purpose was the deeper problem beneath the energy crisis. Parts of the speech were well received at first, but the framing did not hold. Critics from both parties argued it sounded like a president blaming the American people for his own failures, and the perception stuck. Rosalynn had read drafts, offered feedback, and was present at the Camp David meetings beforehand. An unusual gathering of advisors, clergy, academics, and ordinary citizens convened to take the temperature of the country. She believed in the speech's argument. She watched as it was turned against them. The second crisis was Iran. On November 4th, 1979, a group of Iranian students stormed the United States Embassy in Tehran and took 66 American diplomats and citizens hostage. The students were supporters of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who had taken power earlier that year following the revolution that had ousted Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, a leader whom the United States had long supported, a fact that fueled the hostage-takers' grievances. The hostages were held in the embassy compound, and the situation became, almost immediately, the dominant story in American news media. Carter's response was measured and careful, which is exactly the wrong way to look in a crisis that the public experienced as a national humiliation. He imposed economic sanctions on Iran. He pursued diplomatic channels through multiple intermediaries. He froze Iranian assets held in American banks. None of it produced results. The hostages remained in captivity, while the nightly news counted the days of their detention on screen. In April 1980, Carter authorized a military rescue mission, Operation Eagle Claw, that ended in disaster when equipment failures in the Iranian desert forced the mission to be aborted before it reached Tehran. During the withdrawal, 2 aircraft collided on the ground at a desert staging area, killing 8 American servicemen. The failed rescue was reported in full detail, and the images of burned American helicopters in the Iranian desert became another defining symbol of a presidency in crisis. Rosalynn was, throughout this period, a constant presence. In the daily briefings, in the strategy sessions, in the long evenings at Camp David when Jimmy worked through options with his national security team. She did not simply absorb the information. She pushed back, asked hard questions, and on at least several occasions argued for more aggressive action than the State Department was recommending. The depth of her involvement was not widely known at the time, but it was documented afterward by people who were in the room during those months. What was visible to the public was something different. A president who appeared unable to resolve the crisis, whose poll numbers were collapsing, and whose administration seemed paralyzed by events it could neither control nor escape. By the spring of 1980, Jimmy Carter's approval rating had fallen below 30%, lower, at that point, than Richard Nixon's had been during the worst of Watergate. The third crisis was within his own party. Senator Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts had decided, in late 1979, to challenge Carter for the Democratic presidential nomination. Kennedy was the most prominent liberal figure in the Democratic Party, the heir to a political dynasty whose name still carried enormous weight, and his challenge forced Carter into a primary fight at precisely the moment when he needed to be focused entirely on governing. The primary was bitter and personal. Kennedy's campaign argued that Carter had abandoned the liberal principles of the Democratic Party, while Carter's team responded with the kind of sharp-elbowed political combat that did not sit comfortably with the image of decency Carter had cultivated. Carter survived the primary and secured enough delegates to win the nomination at the Democratic National Convention in New York in August 1980. But the convention was a spectacle of division. Kennedy's speech on the final night drew more genuine enthusiasm than Carter's acceptance, and the moment when Kennedy declined to raise Carter's hand in the traditional show of unity was captured by every camera in the building. Rosalynn was furious. She had campaigned hard through the primary season, defending the administration's record with a sharpness that often went further than Jimmy's own surrogates were willing to go. She took the Kennedy challenge personally in a way that Jimmy, more temperamentally detached, did not always match. And then came November. Ronald Reagan won 44 states, Jimmy Carter won 6, plus the District of Columbia. It was not a close race. What happened in the hours and days after that result, to Rosalynn Carter specifically, is a story that most accounts of the Carter presidency do not spend much time on. But it matters because it gets at something real about the cost of the kind of partnership they had built. Segment 3. The personal cost of a public collapse. Rosalynn Carter did not take the 1980 election loss the way Jimmy Carter did. Jimmy Carter was, by the accounts of people close to him, devastated, but relatively composed in the immediate aftermath. He was someone who processed difficulty through action, through work, through purpose, through the discipline that had carried him from a peanut farm in Georgia to the Oval Office. He would find a way forward. He always had. Rosalynn was different. She had invested in the Carter presidency in a way that went beyond political loyalty or spousal support. She had treated it as her own project, her own contribution, her own work, and the loss of it felt to her like a personal defeat in a way that was distinct from what Jimmy experienced. She had spent 4 years building something real: the mental health initiative, the diplomatic role, the weekly policy lunches, the work of being a first lady who was taken seriously as a participant in government rather than as a ceremonial presence. All of that was ending. In the weeks between the election and the inauguration of Ronald Reagan on January 20th, 1981, the White House staff described Rosalynn as subdued in a way that was unlike her, quieter than usual, less engaged with the daily operations of the transition, visibly carrying something heavy. She later wrote, in her memoir First Lady from Plains, published in 1984, that the weeks following the election were among the hardest of her life. She described waking up in the middle of the night and lying awake trying to process what had happened, running back through decisions and moments, and wondering what might have gone differently. She also described, with a candor that was unusual for political memoirs of the period, the difficulty of leaving the White House itself. The building had been her home for 4 years. The staff, the ushers, the housekeepers, the kitchen workers, many of whom had served multiple administrations, were people she had genuine relationships with. Packing up and leaving is something every outgoing first family has to do, but the speed of the transition and the finality of it landed on her differently than it did on Jimmy, and she did not pretend otherwise. There was also the question of what came next. They were going back to Plains. Again. The same town she had not wanted to return to in 1953. The same geography and the same small horizons. Except now they were returning not as a young couple starting over, but as people in their mid-50s, known to the entire world as the couple who had lost, coming home to figure out what the rest of their lives was going to look like. One of the less discussed facts of the Carter post-presidency is that they returned to Plains in genuine financial difficulty. While Jimmy had been in office, the peanut business, managed by a blind trust, had accumulated significant debt, partly due to drought conditions and falling peanut prices during the late 1970s. When they left the White House, they were not destitute, but they were far from comfortable. The house they returned to in Plains was the same modest ranch-style home they had lived in before the governorship. Jimmy Carter had been one of the least wealthy presidents in modern history when he entered office, and he was not notably wealthier when he left. Rosalynn dealt with this practically, as she dealt with most things. She began working on the memoir. She began thinking about what the next chapter of their public work could look like. But the transition was not smooth, and the emotional weight of it, the grief of the lost presidency, the grief of the lost work, the financial stress, the return to planes, was real and visible to the people around them. The marriage, which had always been unusually close and unusually equal, went through its own period of adjustment. Jimmy Carter has spoken in later years about the difficulty of the early post-presidential period, about two people who had spent four of the most intense years imaginable working together at the highest level of public life, suddenly being in a small house, in a small town, without the structure that had defined their days. They argued more than they had in years. They had to find a way to be with each other outside the context of a shared mission, which turned out to be harder than either of them had expected. They got through it, and the way they got through it says something about who they both were. But the story of how the Carter post-presidency eventually became one of the most celebrated in American history, how Jimmy Carter won the Nobel Peace Prize, how Rosalynn built one of the most significant mental health advocacy organizations in the country, that story tends to overshadow the difficulty of the years immediately after 1980, the years when none of that was visible yet, and when the distance between what they had hoped for and what had happened was still raw and immediate. Segment 2. The Mental Health Crusade That Outlived the White House. One of the lasting ironies of Rosalynn Carter's time in public life is that the cause she fought hardest for during the White House years, mental health reform, achieved its most durable results not through the legislation she helped pass, but through the work she did after the presidency ended. The Mental Health Systems Act, signed by Jimmy Carter in October 1980, was designed to fundamentally restructure federal support for mental health services across the country. It called for community-based care, greater funding for research, and a new framework for how the federal government partnered with states on mental health programs. It was the product of 3 years of advocacy, testimony, negotiation, and political maneuvering, and Rosalynn was the driving force behind most of it. Ronald Reagan's administration moved to repeal the core funding provisions of the Act within months of taking office, folding mental health funding into a broader block grant to states with significantly reduced overall resources. The community care infrastructure the Act had aimed to build was never fully constructed. Many of the people it was intended to serve ended up, over the following decades, cycling through emergency rooms, jails, and homeless shelters, rather than receiving sustained treatment, a consequence that mental health advocates would document at length in the years that followed. Rosalynn did not walk away from the issue. In 1987, she founded the Carter Center Mental Health Program in Atlanta as part of the broader Carter Center that she and Jimmy had established in 1982. The mental health program was, from the beginning, a serious research and advocacy operation rather than a symbolic gesture. It produced policy reports, convened working groups of mental health professionals and policymakers, and maintained sustained pressure on state and federal governments to address gaps in mental health services. She also focused, with particular intensity, on the stigma attached to mental illness, the social dimension of the problem that policy alone could not fix. She argued, consistently and publicly, that the way Americans talked about mental illness and the shame that surrounded it was itself a barrier to people seeking treatment. She made this argument in congressional testimony, in speeches, in her writing, and in the personal conversations she had with people throughout her public life who came to her with their own or their families' experiences. The Carter Center Mental Health Program eventually developed into one of the most respected mental health policy organizations in the United States. It convened an annual Rosalynn Carter Symposium on mental health policy that brought together journalists, policymakers, researchers, and advocates, and it trained journalists in how to report on mental health issues responsibly. a specific focus that reflected Rosalynn's long-held view that the way the press covered mental illness was a significant contributor to the stigma surrounding it. In 1996, she published a book specifically about caregiving, Helping Yourself Help Others, which addressed the experience of people caring for family members with serious illnesses, including mental illness. It was practical and specific in a way that her broader policy work was not always able to be, and it reached an audience that the policy papers could not. By the time of her death, Rosalynn Carter's work on mental health had spanned more than 5 decades, from the Georgia Governor's Commission in the early 1970s to the Carter Center programs she continued to support into her 90s. It was a record of sustained commitment that had few parallels in American public life, and it had been built almost entirely outside the formal structures of government. Which is to say, it had been built in spite of the 1980 election, not because of the opportunities the White House provided. There is something in that worth sitting with. The White House had given her a platform and a moment, and the platform had been taken away before the work was finished. So she built a different platform, outside the formal structures of power, and kept going. The Mental Health Systems Act that Reagan gutted in 1981 was, in some ways, replaced, not by a single piece of legislation, but by decades of slower, less dramatic, more durable work. Segment 1. The Final Years and What They Left Behind. Rosalynn Carter spent the last years of her life in the same modest house in Plains, Georgia, where she and Jimmy had lived before the presidency and returned to afterward. The house was not large. The town was not large. The life they had built there, after decades of public work and public scrutiny, was quieter than anything that had come before. Jimmy Carter had, by the late years, become something unusual in American political life, a former president who was more respected in retirement than he had been in office. The Carter Center's work in international election monitoring and disease eradication earned genuine and widespread recognition. His direct participation in housing construction through Habitat for Humanity, swinging a hammer alongside volunteers in cities across the country and around the world, produced a public image of decency and practical service that the presidency had never quite managed to generate. The Nobel Peace Prize came in 2002. Rosalynn was present in all of it. She traveled with Jimmy, participated in Carter Center activities, continued her mental health advocacy, and gave interviews and speeches well into her 80s. She published a memoir of their post-presidential years, Everything to Gain, co-written with Jimmy in 1987, and several other books on caregiving, mental health, and their shared work. She remained sharp, specific, and direct in a way that people who met her for the first time found striking. In May 2023, the Carter Center announced that Rosalynn had been diagnosed with dementia. The announcement was characteristically plain and without self-pity, a statement of fact released to inform people who cared about her. She continued to live at home in Plains, cared for by family and by the small community that had always surrounded them. Jimmy Carter, at that point already in hospice care himself, having entered hospice in February 2023 at the age of 98, was still at home when Rosalynn died on November 19, 2023, at the age of 96. He was with her. She had outlived the presidency by 43 years. She had outlived the legislation she fought for, watched it be dismantled and slowly, partially, rebuilt. She had outlived the world of Plains, Georgia in the 1940s that had seemed to offer so few possibilities, and the Washington of the 1970s that had not quite known what to do with a first lady who wanted to sit in on cabinet meetings. The obituaries were generous. They noted the mental health work, the diplomatic missions, the congressional testimony, the Carter Center. They noted the 57-year marriage, one of the longest of any presidential couple in American history. They noted the return to plains and the post-presidential decades, and the Nobel Prize and the Habitat for Humanity, builds, and all the things that had accumulated in the years after 1980. What the obituaries were less good at capturing, what is perhaps harder to capture in the space of a few paragraphs, is what it actually felt like to be Rosalynn Carter in November 1980, standing at the end of 4 years of work that she had invested in completely, watching it be swept away by an election that she had fought hard to prevent and lost. The grief of that, the return to plains, the slow work of figuring out what to do next. She was not, by nature, someone who lingered in grief. She was someone who moved toward the next thing, who found purpose in action and work and specific, concrete effort. But the loss of the presidency was real, and the cost of it, the personal cost, the professional cost, the cost to the work she had started and could not finish, was real too. She spent 43 years making something out of that loss. Not by pretending it had not happened, not by finding ways to describe it as a blessing in disguise, but by doing the same thing she had always done, identifying the work that needed to be done and doing it, without waiting for anyone to give her permission or a title or a platform. That is not a glamorous story. It does not have the clean narrative shape of triumph over adversity, because real lives rarely do. But it is an honest one, and honesty, of a particular plain-spoken, unhurried, Plains Georgia variety, was perhaps the most consistent thing about Rosalynn Carter from beginning to end. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.